Hello, and thank you so much for joining me. Today we are going to do the free schoolgirl pattern that Danny Choo released a bit ago. I don't remember how long ago it was. I've actually gotten a couple of questions about it, which is fantastic. I love it when you guys make requests. And I decided to bump it up a little bit in the schedule, and my life has been insane lately, so it's not coming out as soon as I would have liked it, but all the same. The day job had some mandatory overtime going on, which is always exciting, and I found out I'm moving across the country in the next months. 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, who knows? So the panic set in, but that's okay. We're gonna get this video out because I want you to have it. So, without further ado, here we go.
Hello. So we have the schoolgirl uniform that Danny Choo released, and it is nice, simple. I was absolutely thrilled by this collar piece because this is literally something I've been putting off drafting for probably months now, and surprise, here it is. So I think this pattern is going to be pretty straightforward. Game plan is basically stitch the darts first, probably stitch the shoulder seams, then stitch the collar on, then stitch the sleeves on, then stitch the side seams together. That's usually the order that I do stuff like this in, and yeah. Okay, so I want to talk for just a second about these tiny little arrows here. They're really in there quite cleverly, and that is, I am 99% sure, a grain line. And grain lines are great. They are highly recommended. What a grain line is basically all of your fabric has the warp and the weft. And despite being a weaver, I never remember which is which. But one is all of the fibers, like all of the threads that go the one direction and the other goes the other direction. And these will absolutely affect your sewing and how it lays and all that good stuff. And if you're a beginner and newer and you're like watching YouTube videos and going, why does all her stuff act the way she wants it to and mine stretches in weird ways? It might be because you're not cutting things on the grain. And what that means is, so it does actually matter between warp and weft. I think these are probably technically supposed to be, this way. That is something I do fudge pretty regularly with doll clothes specifically. I wouldn't recommend fudging it with human clothes, but with doll clothes, I usually get away with it. So take it with a grain of salt. But actually having these lines on the grain, which means you can see here, this line is one that I tore, so it's actually specifically like a straight line. Normally you'd be using the selvage edge, which is this guy, and that is of course guaranteed to be straight as well. But what I do is measure from the bottom, line up your 0, and then over here we line up our grain line down here, and then we also do it up here. And what that does is ensure that all of those threads are running in the correct direction. And this will absolutely affect how things hang. So if that's a problem you've been experiencing, I highly recommend checking your grain lines next time you cut and see if that doesn't help your fabrics behave a little bit better.
So, could you tell I was sick when I was making these videos? Because I get very sick, and you can hear it in my voice. But anyway, now that we're done extolling the virtues of the grain line, we are going to use fray check on any part where I felt I wanted extra precision. And as you can easily see, everything else was cut using a pinking shears to help reduce fraying in a way that doesn't involve gallons of fray check, because boy howdy, that stuff's not cheap. So now we're going to put our darts on, and I'm actually marking these with pencil because I still haven't managed to buy myself a special marking pen. But it's okay. I use the pencil very, very lightly. I poke holes through the pattern where I want to make my dots, and I push the pencil through the hole. It works pretty good. And then we're also going to go around the edge of the collar piece, and I am going to leave about 1/4 of an inch open on both sides of the collar piece. Now we stitch down those darts. And the reason I like to leave that 1/4 of an inch unsewn is because it helps later in the process when I'm putting the collar piece on. And here I just kind of wanted to show you how the collar piece looks when it's actually on. It's nice to be able to see it and kind of visualize it. Yeah, it looks like a collar. How cool is that? Sort of. When you there you go. All right, we got there in the end. A little bit more struggling than it probably needed to, but now we are stitching the back seam together, which I forgot to talk about at the beginning, but yes, you do need to stitch the back seam before you put your collar piece on. And then we do our shoulder seams as well. I'm marking the center front here, and I just kind of wanted to show you the beautiful details on this pattern. Shows you where to put your front closures, whether you're using snaps or buttons, and specifically shows you as well that you need to fold the edge over twice. This is something that I did and then ironed flat, which I'll show you here in just a sec. There you go. And that just gives you a little bit sturdier surface for whatever closure you happen to be using, so it's a nice touch. You could actually do very tiny buttons if you were feeling especially ambitious, which I never am. But, you know, I've seen people do it and it looks amazing, and kudos to them because that's a lot of awesome detail. Now I am just stitching down that folded over edge for both decoration and practical reasons. Now I'm marking the center of the collar piece because we will need that to match up with the center back of the shirt. And then our front pieces are going to butt right up to that newly folded edge. And this is where you find out if your pins are old and cruddy or not, because they just won't go through that many layers of fray checked material. And for this part, I do recommend using a lot of pins and being careful about it, because you're essentially sewing two curved edges to each other. And like sleeves, when they're curving in opposite directions, it makes it a little tricky.
So that went poorly. And it was my own fault because I sewed it through the machine like this, and I feel like I should have sewed it through the machine like this. It's easier for me to keep this gunk out of the way than it is to keep this from doing that. Though, it's not such a big deal. It's an easy fix.
So I just seam ripped most of that and did it again because, hey, not everything is perfect on the first try, and that's okay.
Okay. Now it's going to be the part that I have the hardest time describing. So, all this junk is naturally disposed to iron upwards, which is good, because that's what we want it to do. Now this piece, we have this extra little flap that we can fold over. Okay. Fold over. And again, iron really well. And then this can essentially be stitched down by either sewing in this seam on this side, which is what I tend to do, especially at doll scale, or you could even top stitch if you wanted the top stitch look. Honestly, I kind of alternate between the two depending on what I want it to look like, so it is your call. Actually, top stitching might end up being a little bit easier, only sometimes if I top stitch I end up so high that this part will flip back and come out again. So it's kind of your call. You know it's going to be covering up the previous seam though, so if you sew along that seam and you have pinned it correctly, yeah, so you know you've got that little lip there that will get caught while you're stitching. So before I pin this fully, I am going to go iron it. You want everything nice and ironed. It just makes it so much easier to work with, and it makes your final product look better.
Now that it's ironed, I start actually pinning that down, and you can see I am trimming off some of that extra seam allowance, especially in the collar area. It can bulk up extremely fast, especially in small scale, so I'll trim out like corners and edges and stuff that just are kind of not really necessary. Yeah, there, I did it again. And really that helps make things much easier to pin, makes things easier to sew through. And I did end up going with the top stitch, which turned out to be a really good idea because I was using so little overlap that it ended up working out perfectly. I was glad I didn't stitch in the ditch instead. And I'd hop in and do the sleeves real quick too. We're just hemming those. That's pretty straightforward. After we hem the sleeves, we start pinning them down, and you've seen me do this many, many times. This process doesn't change. Make sure the centers line up, make sure the edges line up, and squish everything in to be as even as possible. Now that we've got our sleeves sewn on, we are going to pin the side seams together. And sew them. Once I sew the side seams, I do iron them immediately, and then I iron the hem as well. And then I started sewing the hem, which apparently I didn't get a lot of footage of, but that's okay. We move on to adding the clasps, and I marked those carefully and very, very lightly with pencil. And I need to test my clasp because these are teeny tiny no-sew snaps, and they can break and not work very well if your fabrics are too thick. So I grabbed scraps of my nice fabric and put them, so there's 3 layers, because I know that because of how the edge of the shirt is, there's 3 layers of fabric there. So I test my snap out first, and this is just to make sure that it can handle going through that many layers of fabric. And it can! Yay! I really like these no-sew snaps. They're incredibly hard to find in the scale. These are 7mm, and I've only ever seen them available on eBay. And they're nice though when they do work, because I don't like sewing snaps even the tiniest bit, and these just take, you know, you line it up, you stuff the little prongs through the fabric. I use a ancient spool of thread to put over top of the snap. There it is, there's my ancient spool of thread. And then hammer it. And that little circle underneath is actually the tiniest anvil that my dad gave me, because he knows I do stuff like this, and it's great. But if you don't have that, really a block of wood that you don't care about is fine. Like, it doesn't need to be a special surface. I just have the tiniest anvil and I love it, so I use it. After we have put all the snaps on, we try it on our doll and get very excited because it fits beautifully. Of course it does. We followed Danny Choo's pattern, but I was really happy with how this one turned out, and I hadn't planned on making the bow and skirt immediately, and like the next day I did it. So that will be the next video coming up, of course, so that you can see how to do the skirt and the bow for the schoolgirl uniform. But even just this shirt is beautiful and so versatile. I can see using this in so many situations, so I'm pretty thrilled about that. And I think it turned out great. So thank you so much for sticking with me, even though my release schedule has been kind of completely random. Unfortunately, it will stay random until we do move, but after that, I should have lots of free time to make cool stuff and make videos about it. So I'm really looking forward to that, and I hope you are too. Please like and subscribe if you want to see more, because there's definitely more coming. And thank you so much. I hope you have a good day.